أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فأزثنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب عليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغن عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة وأحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملت أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إنا أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لتمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمره ننخسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناهم من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلق قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
صلوا على النبي. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Hey salam اس پہ جو کہتی تھی میرے ویر حسین، خاک میں کس نے ملا دی تیری تصویر حسین؟ تم تو پردیس میں سر اپنا کٹا کر سوئے، ننگے سر آئی ہے مجرے کو یہ ہمشیر حسین، کیا عبادت کا تمہیں شوق تھا؟ اللہ اللہ، تاغ شمشیر بھی جاری رہی، تکبیر حسین، اما زہرا کا جنازہ تو اٹھا تھا شب کو، مجھ کو بلوے میں لیے جاتے ہیں بے پیر حسین، تیرے لاشے کو کفن بینا ملا میرے اخی، سر پہ چادر بھی نہیں، کیا کروں تدبیر حسین، تازیان تیرے بچوں کو لگاتے ہیں لعین، کس گناہ کیے ہمیں دیتے ہیں تعزیر حسین، جد کو ماں باپ کو بھائی حسن کو روئی، کیا بری میری بھی بچپن سے ہے تقدیر حسین، شام کو جاتی ہوں میں تم کو خدا کو سونپا، میرے مظلوم اخی خوش تھے شمشیر حسین، ہے سلام اس پہ جو کہتی تھی میرے ویر حسین، خاک میں کس نے ملا دی تیری تصویر حسین. صلوا علی النبی. اللہم صل علی محمد وآل محمد. فاتحہ.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sayyid Hasan Rizvi, respected elders, brothers, sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for all the names listed on the screen in Kul Arwahil Mu'mineen wal Mu'minat. Sawab al-Fatiha. Ayat Mayyujibun is requested for all the names listed on the screen, and whoever is in need of it here and elsewhere will recite this together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Amma yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu as-su'. Amma yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu as-su'. أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Now let us invite Saiyid to come forward to recite tonight's majlis for Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Salawat.
Okay. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة مع الصلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، خاتم النبيين، شفيع المذنبين، رحمة للعالمين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا وطبيب ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين المكرمين الخيرين الفاضلين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين لتراب مقدمه الفدا ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد صلوات على محمد وعلى محمد. Mu'mineen, mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight on the 8th of Shawwal, Muslims around the world, particularly the Shia of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, are commemorating what has been come to known as Yaum-e-Gham wal-Inhidam or Yaum-ul-Hadam, or in some communities, Yaum Al-Baqi, which is this day of gham, of grief, of sorrow, or hadam or inhidam, which is destruction, and Al-Baqi, meaning the destruction of Baqi. So we've been gathering, for almost now 100 years, some say even more, in commemorating this tragic loss for the not just followers of the Ahlul Bayt, but Muslims worldwide. Because one of the mistakes that we make when we talk about the destruction of the graves in the mausoleums at Al-Baqi is that sometimes we forget. We think it's only the 4 imams of ours that their mausoleums, right, those areas were destroyed and razed. But many other graves around that time in that same year were also destroyed as well. Many graves of the wives, of the ashab, scholars, many things that this Al Saud, they had destroyed in that year. And when it first happened, this was the first, because it happened twice in history. The first time was, I believe, in 1805 or 1806. That's when it first took place. And in that year, when it took place, there was, a huge outcry from the world, specifically the Ottoman Empire at that time. And it was actually the Ottomans, meaning a Sunni empire, which went in, fought the Al Saud, right, the Wahhabis basically, removed them from power, and then rebuilt everything. Right? It was Sunnis, not Shias who did this. But then, unfortunately, the Al Saud, the family, they regained their power. They formed another army, and they attacked once again, retook control, and then destroyed it once again in approximately 1925 or 1926. Now, I think generally we know, some points about history. We know why the Wahhabis have such an issue with this, because Sunnis, obviously Shias have no issue, right? We obviously revere these sha'air Allah, these signs of Allah, these symbols of Allah. And Sunnis have historically done the same. We've never had an issue or any sort of confrontation or conflict regarding these ideas, regarding building these, raised sort of varis or graves over the graves of the, personalities that are revered by Allah. Nobody's had issues. It was when Ibn Taymiyyah and his students like Ibn al-Qayyim, they came along, and because some would argue what their issues were. Was it that they had this extreme form of Islam? Did they have this ultra hatred toward Shias, which blinded them from the truth? And then, of course, the Al Saud picking up off that. Was it just socio-political for them? They didn't care about the actual religion. For them, it was more socio-political. They just wanted to show that they had power, and in order for them to control Muslims, they needed to show that we can do Amr bil Ma'ruf, Nahi anil Munkar. So we'll grab some extremist sheikhs, we'll take their fatwa, we'll work with them, pay them off a little bit, and then we'll work together and destroy these things. So there's various different theories there, but that's not what I want to actually talk about tonight. What I'd like to discuss tonight is the response that normally Shias have given, and Muslims in general. When we hear this, when you hear these points by Wahhabis saying, you're not allowed to build these raised graves. You can't build these mausoleums. You can't build these buildings over graves. It's not allowed. It's shirk, it's bid'ah. We know all these classic lines. Again, Sunni scholarship, Shia scholarship has obviously said that this is ridiculous. We are allowed to do this. And there's a reason why we have this huge building of Masjid al-Nabawi raised there. Now, interestingly enough, the Saudis wanted to get rid of that, and still to this day they're trying to get rid of that. But even the most staunch Wahhabi is like, look, that's going to be a big problem if we do remove that. So there is a limit even for them. Because they know that if that happens, then even the contemporary and classical Sunnis, they will fight back against this as well. So there's, red lines there. In terms of our response, right, one way is looking at the evidence that Wahhabis and Salafis have given. And usually it's just one or two completely out of context ahadith, right? Usually only found in their books that, you can't pray to graves, you can't raise graves, which even with classical Sunni scholarship, they say it's inauthentic. The meaning that they're attributing, no Sunni scholar has ever done. So that argument is tossed aside. But we ourselves, we have our own sort of Quranic argument that normally we bring. And I used this phrase, a few minutes before. And this is classically coming from Surah Al-Hajj, right? Surah 22, ayah number 32. Where Allah there says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَمَنْ يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. And, there's this, and whoever does this ta'zeem, who magnifies and glorifies and raises the status of sha'a'ir Allah. What that means, inshallah, we'll talk about. But for now, we'll just call it these symbols of Allah. Allah says, فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever does this ta'zeem and magnifies and raises these symbols of God, this is where you'll find taqwa in their hearts. And of course, this is where our usual point comes from. So look, these things are sha'a'ir Allah. When we are revering these, the Ahlul Bayt or the companions, whoever it is, that's what we're doing. How can you say that this is shirk or bid'ah or kufr, whatever it is? We're going by what the Quran allows us to talk about. What I want to focus on is a little bit of the background of this ayah specifically, like these points that we're talking about. Because there's two distinctive elements within this ayah. One is ta'zeem, right? It says, مَن يُعَذِّمْ, whoever does ta'zeem, who raises and magnifies. So we're going to talk about that. But more importantly, it says, وَمَن يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ. What does it mean to be sha'a'ir Allah? What does it mean to be a symbol, a mark, or a sign of God? So I want to look at a few different things. We're going to talk about just the Arabic sort of definition and meaning first. Then we're going to look at a little bit of the history. What is the actual historical context of this verse? Because interestingly enough, like when we think about signs of God, normally you think of a masjid or the Kaaba, right? Things like that. But in the Quran, Allah mentions camels as a sign of God. How's the camel a sign of God? Within the same context of these ayat. So how is that possible? We'll talk about that as well. We'll take a general meaning of what these mean. And then finally, we'll see that this has actually been expanded and generalized for even contemporary issues as well. Like Al-Baqi, and even things that you and I are dealing with right now in this day and age. Inshallah, we'll try to go through this discussion. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So let's start first with this word, sha'a'ir. Sha'a'ir is the plural of sha'ira. Sha'ira just means symbol, mark, sign, token, emblem, right? Very simple. And it's coming from the word shi'r, which we've talked about, I think, maybe a year ago or a couple of months ago, I believe. Shi'r is it's talking about a type of knowledge, a type of perception, a type of awareness that somebody can get. And usually the connection is that whenever you see a certain symbol, something very simple, a mark or an emblem, a sign, a logo, that brings to your mind a whole different level of meaning, right? Think about when you see a cross. When you see a cross, it's not just thinking about like a T or whatever. You're thinking about like all of Christianity right now. You're thinking about their version of the crucifixion. You're thinking about Christians wearing it around their chest as a necklace, right? All these ideas come to your mind just from one little symbol. Or nowadays when Muslims, when they see, or anybody else, they see a crescent moon, right? Or the symbol. Even if you see like a crescent cookie, there's automatically this association with Muslims or Eid or something like that, right? Just from these small, simple symbols, it can unearth and unlock a whole host of meanings. That's what we mean by sha'ira or sha'air. From one simple idea, there's a lot of dimensions and hidden understandings and meanings under that. And a person who has real ma'rifah and perception can take that small meaning, that small symbol, that sign and token and mark and emblem, and they can understand what really the author or the speaker or the person who's indicating what they're trying to talk about. So when we're talking about sha'a'ir Allah, these signs or marks or emblems of Allah, what is Allah actually meaning here? So this is generally what our ulama have mentioned. Even Sunni ulama like the famous Al-Qurtubi, who has a tafsir himself, he mentions that these sha'air Allah are anything that God wants to use as a tool, as a wasila, as a medium, in order for him to teach us something, to make us aware of something, to get some sort of lesson. He's going to give us these marks or these ideas so that we take a lesson from that. Alama Tabatabai, Qaddasallahu Sirru, in Al-Mizan and other mufassirin as well, say that Allah, specifically, these signs, these sha'air Allah, are set up as marks and emblems specifically for the ibadah and worship of Allah. That's what they're for. Ita'a and ibadah. That's what these sha'air Allah. Now, how is he getting this understanding? This is where we need to now go into the very specific historical context of all these ayat. And this is where we'd have to actually look into Surah Al-Hajj. And obviously it's called Surah Al-Hajj for a reason, because many of these ayat are talking about the rules, manasik, and the ideas behind Hajj themselves. So I want to mention a few of those. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I'm not going to go line by line, right? Because, we could. I think it'll take up too much time. But in the beginning, if you go back to, let's say, around ayah 29, over there, Allah will mention Baytul Atiq, right? Right? The house of Allah. And that's an obvious sign for you and I, right? The house of Allah, the Kaaba, right? Okay. He's talking about performing the tawaf. So that's giving us our first idea, right? There's a sign, meaning the Kaaba, and the tawaf that we're performing around it. So it's a symbol, it's an emblem, and also a part of worship is dedicated towards that as well. And now keep one thing in mind. This is not just a sign for Muslims. Remember, even these pagans, these mushrikun and mushrikeen, they were still doing tawaf and performing these sort of, the Kaaba had a meaning for them in their minds too, right? So keep that in your minds too. Then in the next ayah, in ayah 30, Allah starts there with وَمَنْ يُعَذِّمْ حُرَمَاتِ اللَّهِ فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّي. Whoever does ta'zeem and magnifies the huramat Allah, the things that Allah has made haram, the prohibitions. So the first thing Allah's calling out is saying, look, when you go on Hajj, remember, there are certain things you're not allowed to do. If you want to connect with me, your Rabb, what's good for you is that you keep to these prohibitions. And we know many of these things when we go, right? When you put on the ihram, you're not supposed to, comb your hair. You can't look in a mirror. You can't put on fragrances like perfume or itar, right? So you're around a bunch of smelly other Muslims, obviously, right? Because you can wear deodorant, but it has to be unscented, right? According to most maraja. So it's a very difficult thing, but you've got to follow these rules. And if you don't, there are consequences, right? You've got to pay the price. It's slaughtering this animal or redoing something. So in here, Allah's saying, look, the first level of ta'zeem, of magnifying and glorifying and showing respect and giving ihtiram and dignity, you have to do towards the things that Allah is prohibiting, is forbidding. It's not just these signs and these things which touch our heart. Even the ahkam of Allah, the things which He's saying you can't do, even for something limited like Hajj. Like these have a lot of hurma. They have a lot of value to them. Don't just take them lightly. And then, He continues on talking about idol worship. I'm going to skip that part. And then we go to, finally, in ayah 32, which we had just mentioned, right? Where He says, وَمَنْ يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. So over there He's saying, look, don't just magnify, glorify, and do ihtiram and show respect for the things which are haram, but every single sign of Allah. Every single thing which is a symbol and mark. That's what you have to honor and dignify. So over here, this is why in a lot of translations, it won't just say symbols, it'll say the rituals of Allah. Because many mufassirin here are saying, because the context is talking about Hajj specifically, the sha'ar here, before it was about things that Allah has made haram, over here it's talking about the various other types of worship that you have to perform as well. Everything else that you're doing during Hajj time. And some will even expand that and say anything else that you perform which is a wajib action or a mustahab action. These are marks of God because they are marks of ibadah and marks of irta'a. But then we come to the strange part. And I'm going to skip a few ayat. We're going now to ayah number 36. And then Allah says there, وَالْبُدْنَ جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُمْ مِنْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ لَكُمْ فِيهَا خَيْرٌ. Now again, if you don't know the context, this is very strange. I don't know if it's on the, I don't think I gave it to them. So, and it says, and camels, or the camel, we have made it for you amongst the various sha'air Allah. We've made the camel amongst a sign for you. And fiha khayrun. And there's good for you. Okay, what does this have to do with anything? First, you're talking about the Kaaba and performing tawaf. You're talking about staying away from idols. You're talking about, keeping away from what you've prohibited and sticking to your signs and, showing ihtiram for them. But then you're saying, with all this other stuff, you're throwing a camel in the picture? Like, what does this have to do with anything? And a camel is good for you? Where does this fall in for Hajj? So you have to understand a little bit of the context here, which I want to mention now. If you can recite another salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So I mentioned before that we need to know the Jahiliyyah culture of the Arabs too. Because they were performing Hajj in their own version, right? And a lot of our ulama say, a lot of the ayat in the Quran, a lot of the surahs themselves will make absolutely no sense to you and I because we're not familiar with what the Arabs were practicing at that time. And many of the ayat are calling out the Arabs for what they were doing. Right? Not just the Jews or the Christians of that time, but just the general pagans and other individuals. Their practices had strayed, so Allah was calling them out. And if you and I don't know what that is, it's going to sound very strange. So over here, the context matters too. So many of us know that when you go for Hajj, there has to be, and when you're done, a sacrifice has to be performed, right? So what many individuals, especially those who, in that time, whether they were in Mecca or Medina, wherever they were, they normally, especially those who were, let's say, a bit wealthier, they had their own sacrifices that they would bring with them, right? If they had various animals, like a camel, for example, they'd take a camel, and what they would do is they'd actually mark it somehow. And there's different ways that they would mark it. Some would, cut the animal just a little bit, get a little bit of its blood, and mark it there to show everybody that this animal is meant for the sacrifice of Hajj, not for anything else. And when they would see that and they would remember that, and other people would see that, then they would say, you know what? Since this is for Allah or for the gods or their idols or whatever they were doing, since it's meant for sacrifice, it's marked, you're not allowed to ride the animal, and you're not allowed to milk and drink milk from this camel. And for us, okay, that seems rational and logical, right? Like, why would you want to abuse or make use of this if this is just going to be, sacrifice and you want to, give it out to the poor or whatever it is? Okay, kind of makes sense. The problem was that Allah comes here and says, who told you you're supposed to do that? Who said you're not allowed to ride these camels? Who said you're not allowed to use them for milk? So now you go back to the context. Allah saying, وَالْبُدْنَا جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُم مِّن شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ. He said, look, this camel is from amongst my symbols and signs. I'm the one who dictates to you what you can do and what you can't do. Not your superstitions, not your Jahiliyyah culture. I tell you what is sacred and what's not sacred. Don't hold certain things sacred because your forefathers have held them sacred. And that's why he says, لَكُمْ فِيهَا خَيْرٌ. In there, he's like, I put khair in there for you. I made camels so that you can use them to ride. That's the whole point of them. I made them so that when you're traveling, you can use them and you can milk them, right? He says, why are you, starving yourself of these benefits? I gave you these benefits. Your superstitions and your Jahiliyyah culture has now infiltrated and penetrated into Islamic culture and now has removed some of the benefits. You now have destroyed and then takhrib and ruined some of the signs and symbols of Allah. And now I think you can start to make the connections as how we're going to go forward as well. So this is one thing. One thing why this is being mentioned here is Allah saying, look, the superstitious culture of the Arabs during Hajj had to be eliminated. So that's why it's being mentioned here. Look, this is from my signs. These are my symbols. When you're saying don't ride and don't milk, this is your stuff. I'm not telling you to do that. You need to follow what I'm telling you. So make sure you stick to that. And the second thing is, the other part of it is, budna actually doesn't just mean camel. If you go to the original meaning, it means a fat camel, like a well-fed camel. Now the other problem that some of these Arabs were doing was that, because look, they wouldn't just usually take one camel, the sacrificial camel. They'd bring a lot of stuff with them. So they'd bring all their big fat camels, their nice ones, so that they can ride on that, or they can milk those. And they'd take the ones that were going to die, these skinny, nasty ones. They say, oh, we'll sacrifice this for God. Because they're thinking like, God doesn't need to eat. Like, what's he going to do with the camel? Well, to sacrifice it and give it to God. Right? The same sort of idea that Qabil had in his mind too, right? Oh, who cares, right? Let me just sacrifice the weakest, the most valueless thing I have. Let me give that to God. Who cares? What does God need to do with it? Right? Again, this sort of rationalization of religion, which should be good, but when it's done like this improperly, it becomes a big problem. Because you can falsely rationalize things, right? Seems intuitive, but it's actually not intuitive. That's the point. So the other thing that Allah's trying to say here is that, look, when you want to sacrifice for Allah, when you want to sacrifice for me, you shouldn't be giving something that's easy. You should be giving the best. It should be difficult for you. So your budna, it's one of my signs, you should be bringing the best thing that you have. Bring your fat camel. Literally, that's what budna is. It's a fat camel. Bring your healthy ones there. Because that's the things I want you to see. That's what I want to see if you can sacrifice those or not. So this is sort of the level one or historical contextual meaning of what was happening then. Is that this ta'zeem of these symbols of God were for what? Two things. Is one, to remove the superstitious cultures in Hajj for the Arabs. The fact that they wouldn't ride the camels and they wouldn't, milk the camels. And also to say that, look, don't bring your weakest one, bring your best camels, right? Sacrifice for God and, seriously. Don't make this religion and, these rituals a joke. So then ta'zeem, this honoring or dignifying Allah and the signs of God, is that you actually should be riding your camels and you should be drinking for them. You should be doing that. In fact, one time Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he was passing by somebody who was on their way to Hajj. And he saw that this person, he saw the mark that was on the camel. So he knew that this person was bringing it for a sacrifice. But the person was just carrying it or just riding it, bringing it along. He wasn't riding on it. So the Prophet just gives him a command. He says, irkabha. He says, ride your camel, get on the camel. That's it. And the person says, what? He's like, look, I get it, but this is for sacrifice. I'm bringing this for Hajj. You want me to get on top of a camel that I'm bringing for Hajj? He's like, no, I'm not doing that. So the Prophet responds to him, irkabha waylak. He said it multiple times because this person refused. Now, irkabha waylak. So irkabha, he's saying to get on it, ride the camel. Waylak, the Shakespearean translation is, woe upon you. Now again, this Shakespearean English doesn't really help us, but I'd say maybe the best contemporary translation is like, what's the matter with you? What's wrong with you? Because some people think that, the prophets and imams are always just these calm, nice, just loving individuals. No. The prophets and imams, when somebody was doing something, foolish or dumb or they weren't listening, they'd have said, what's the matter with you? I'm telling you to get on your camel, get on your camel. Like this is a command from your prophet. Sometimes we have this false notion that, yes, the prophets and imams were this, just lovey-dovey hippie people walking around showing love and respect to everybody all the time. No. Sometimes they, had to call people out for what they were doing. It's not just that, because some people nowadays say that, la'na is not something the imam would say. Who said the la'na is not something the imam would say? The imams used very harsh language. Look at the letters that they wrote, both Imam Ali alayhi salam and Imam Hasan alayhi salam. Look at the letters they wrote to Muawiyah. They were very harsh with him. Look at Nahj al-Balagha, when Imam is speaking to some of these corrupt governors. Look at the language he uses there. People who interrupted the Imam in front of his khutbah uses very, very harsh language. So somebody who says these kind of, again, very, I'd say, liberal interpretations of the Ahlul Bayt, I'd say, look, you're missing out a lot of different ahadith. I don't know how you're going to answer for that. Yes, generally, the major principle is, yes, show love, show compassion, show mercy. But there are certain cases when people are stubborn, when they're not listening, when they have spiritual diseases, sometimes you have to put your foot down. Right? This is something that you have to do. So we have to be careful that we are not creating a false version of the Ahlul Bayt. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So this was the very specific historical meaning of ta'zeem of the sha'air Allah, right? In the Hajj context. Now, is there a way that we can apply it right now in today's times? How do we do that, right? It was meant for Hajj, and some, especially Sunni Mufassirin, and some Shias as well, say, look, that's all that Allah means here. He's just talking about Hajj and that's it. But many Mufassirin say, look, Allah, in these, if you actually look at the words, it's not specifically mentioning only Hajj. He says some of these things are amongst the various symbols of God, meaning that there's other things as well. So our ulama says, look, any single thing which reminds you about Allah, which makes you do the dhikr of Allah, anything which brings your heart closer to Allah, that is min sha'air Allah. That's a symbol of God too. And of course, what greater thing, what greater symbol is there than Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So of course, this is why it's such a big deal. And we make a big deal why when you're destroying these mausoleums, right? These buildings that were constructed and erected on top of the graves, we want to, everybody was acknowledging them and revering the Ahlul Bayt for their connection to Allah. Again, Sunni and Shia alike. They were visiting them. There was no issues. But these individuals who came along, right, later on, Ibn Taymiyyah and, the rest of his students, and this Wahhabi Salafi movement that was created in the 1800s, 1900s, which some say was created, again, by the British of that time as well. All of this stuff was to slowly do away from any trace of godliness in their hearts. Because if first you can remove all of the signs of God, then the whole idea is, then you can get rid of the taqwa al-qulub, right? Allah's saying, if you do ta'zeem of these signs of Allah, that's how you get taqwa in your heart. So therefore, somebody who's now taking away the ta'zeem and taking away the ihtiram and the honor and respect for these signs of God, then by default, they're trying to remove the taqwa in our hearts. They're trying to make sure that we have no remembrance of God anymore. And now you can see it very clearly, the akhlaq of some of the people because of the things that have been raised there. Even these so-called, police that are there, walking around, making sure people can't even, pay their respects to the Ahlul Bayt, walking around with their clubs, with these very, harsh akhlaq. Of course, because they have no reminders of Allah in their hearts. If you had these reminders there, if you knew the status of the Ahlul Bayt, or any of those other companions that you yourself revere too, they never acted like this. Where are you getting this sunnah from? What graves were ever destroyed during the time of the Prophet? Where are you getting this from? No scholar had ever done this before. But again, this is why we're saying there's some other conspiracy that's working behind the scenes that we have to be aware of. For us now, we think about the other signs too. There, besides, dharis and going for ziyarah, even the simple actions which distinguish us as Muslims, those are also symbols and marks of God. Jama'ah prayer. For those of us, right, who were there at the park yesterday. Praying Jama'ah prayer, we know that obviously people are going to look. It happens. But there is a chance that when somebody sees that, and this does happen, especially when they see that Jama'ah prayer, they're like, we don't see things like this. People moving in succession, in tartib, one by one, all together like this, right? There's this like beauty that's there. And you ask certain non-Muslims when they're looking at it, like, your version of prayer is something we've never seen before. And some people get very captivated by it. This is a sign of God that should remind other people of Allah as well. And it's funny, I know some people, they get shy when it comes to praying in public, which is understandable. But even then, right, most people actually are not really, turned off by it. They're not really like, oh my God, I don't want to see that. They're actually like, if you actually ask them, and I'm sure you've had people come up to you as well if you've ever had to do that. They say, you know what, we really respect the fact that you're able to go and pray in public like this. Like we can't pray to God in public like that. We have no sign like this. We have no formal prayer like this. For you to come on the grass in the public park to do that, it's a big thing. And those who, let's say, are hiding their religiosity because of the sort of atheistic, secular world that we're living in, they are now remembering God in their hearts too. Of course, in their own way, but that's something that even we as Muslims, we can help other people connect back with, their version of religiosity and God, which is a good thing too. We want people to be connected back to Allah, back to God. We don't want to be pushing people away, right? But the question then is, what about some of these other signs and sha'air Allah? Like Eid, or one of the greatest signs, the sign that we've all been waiting for, Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala farajuhu sharif. Are we really performing ta'deeb and honoring these signs? So Jama'ah prayer, there's ways of doing that, right? Following the ahkam properly, learning your rules, making sure you know what you're doing. There is a specific way. Don't go ahead of the imam. Don't fall too far behind. It has to look. It should look like you're almost like we have all these air shows that happen. The beauty in that is that they're all flying in formation, right? That's how a real Jama'ah salah should look. Not one guy in the back, 5 minutes behind somebody else, like imam still finishing ruku. This guy's in sujood. Like no, that's not how it works. It should look like in proper formation, right? We should follow the ahkam properly, right? Make it look beautiful. Do we apply these same sort of dignifying actions, and we do ta'zeem to Eid and Imam Mahdi? And the reason I'm mentioning these two, again, because it's contemporary, is because right now, I'm sure many of you have heard, many people were invited to the White House for this Eid banquet, and they're invited every year for this. And they're there taking selfies with all these individuals, like the president. Okay. And there's Shias who are doing this as well too. And just, want to ask them a question, especially people who are sharing this kind of stuff like, oh wow, it's a great thing that it's happening. Okay. Are you really honoring the symbols of Allah, like Eid? And like Imam Mahdi, who came out of the words in the mouth of this individual as well, right? And everybody was like, oh my God, he said Imam Mahdi, we're so proud. Why are you proud of that? Why are you proud of this individual who's been sending drones and gifts to the same people who are destroying Baqi and making sure it doesn't get reconstructed? Why are you so happy that he's having an Eid banquet, or that he mentioned the name of the Mahdi? Why are people taking selfies with him and being so honored by this? Would we have this same sort of honor if we were sitting with the time of the Abbasids? who had the same name of Mahdi in their mouth too, who were there, who took fadak. Well, obviously it came from the Umayyads originally. But would we want to go around and say, yes, I can't believe these guys are honoring our signs and sha'air as well? No, this is not something we should be proud of. I'm very shocked that Muslims are honored by this and that they're sharing that this is a good sign for Muslims. I don't think that's the case. For me, again, this is my humble opinion, I think that this is actually lowering the dignity of the Ahlul Bayt. This is lowering the status of Eid. This is lowering the status of Imam Mahdi. That a person who's one of the causes for Muslims to die overseas, who's still supporting the Zionist regime, who's causing the death of our Muslim brothers and sisters in occupied Palestine right now, who is causing the deaths of our brothers and sisters in Yemen right now, right? Those who are connected with, of course, supporting Daesh all around the world too. Why are we, happy that these guys, these individuals, are ones who are promoting or mentioning stuff about our faith? I don't think it's a good sign at all. In fact, I'd say, listen, please don't mention those things. Like, this is not for you. We do ta'zeem. We can, actually honor and respect these signs. You don't do justice to this. You don't have the right to talk about these things. And if you do that, we're not going to, feel proud that you're doing these things. So I think we really need to be careful about how we do that. And the final point that I want to mention as well as when we're talking about ta'zeem is in the same way, when Allah for Hajj was saying, don't bring your superstitions to Hajj, when these guys didn't want to ride their camel or milk them, the same way we have to be careful with modern day symbols of Allah as well. How many times are we really bringing our own superstitious ideas to these symbols of Allah? And some of these things I've mentioned before as well too, right? Again, this is where some traditionalists will get upset, but it's okay, right? If I make the liberals angry, I have to make traditionalists and conservatives angry too, right? I should be fair. Equal opportunity hatred. So a lot of these backward superstitions and ideas and cultural ideas there's nothing in Islam for them, right? And this is something I think I've mentioned before. I'll mention it again. The idea of alams, right? Of these parchams, these tabuts and flags. These are signs of Allah, no doubt. And they should be revered. We should do ta'adim of them, right? If you're connected to them, that's great. Now, if somebody does not want to, it doesn't have the same connection as you, that's also okay too, right? You don't have the right to judge them. But those of us who do have that connection towards them, right? Who feel that connection to the Ahlul Bayt when we see a flag, you see the alam, you see the tabut, you see all these things, like, okay, good. But then when you start to make up your own ahkam, which don't exist, that somebody who's in the state of janaba now can't come near it and touch it. Well, where are you getting that from? The same way that these Arab Jahils, the same way they said, no, we can't ride these sacrificial camels, we can't milk them. The same way we have a lot of these made up ahkam. It's funny, one of the scholars in Iran a few hundred years ago, he actually wrote a book which he wrote as actually, it was satirical work of all of the different fake superstitious rules that Iranian aunties came up with. It was a whole book that he came up with because that's how many things they had. And I guarantee if we all sit down, I'm sure we could probably make our own Tawdi al-Masail based on these sort of rules too. And a lot of us, we don't even, we're shocked when we actually, and now people, they say, so-and-so rule, right, Hasan? No, that's not a rule. Really? Well, I've heard it since I was growing up. I said, okay, no problem. Let's double check Tawdi al-Masail, no problem. Let's double check. It's not there. And they're like, but my father and my grandfather and my grandparents and all the way from India and so, okay, that's fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean it came from Allah. So we have to be very careful how we are treating the sha'air Allah. Again, let me be very clear. I'm not saying we have to get rid of culture. I'm not saying that we can't express, we have to express, we're all going to express culture. We say it in Urdu or English. These are all cultural expressions of our love for the Ahlul Bayt and the way that we express our grief. And our grief is specifically a sign and a alama of a mu'min as well. We have a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam, where he's reported to have said, Al-Huzn min sha'air Allah. Min sha'air Allah. That huzn, grief, sadness, is amongst the sign of the mu'mineen. A mu'min, well, they have to show grief, right? None of this positive psychology and being happy all the time. No. Corporate America wants you to be happy all the time so that you don't feel like you're getting taken advantage of, right? When you're in the workplace. That's why they want you to be positive all the time. Yeah, be happy because you're barely making ends meet. Yeah, just smile all the time. Think positively. No. You should be upset. There should be a workers' revolt or something like that. Or you should unionize, whatever. Not to say I'm always pro-union, but you know what I mean, right? You have to have that response. And now when we take this into consideration, when we put it back there, if people like these Al Saud, like the Wahhabis and the Salafis, if they are going to destroy the signs of Allah, if they are not going to do ta'zeem, then we'll increase our ta'zeem. If you're going to destroy the signs of God, then we'll increase the signs of God. No problem. So if you want to destroy Baqi, then every year we're going to come here and we will commemorate Yaum-e-Gham. Doesn't matter if the Ahlul Bayt didn't do that. Obviously, the Ahlul Bayt didn't do it because there was no Baqi in that sense then. There was no these erected structures. But when we create something that is a sign of God and you want to come and destroy it, then you better believe we're going to respond. So if people want to go and protest, yes, go and protest. That's one way that we can show that we're not going to stand around here and do nothing. Or if people want to take more, let's say, visible action, then go ahead and do that. But we don't take this standing down. And a Shia shouldn't take these things standing down lightly. When you deal with the shayateen and the taghut and these rebellious sort of forces, again, it's not this peace and love thing that everybody thinks about. No, we come there and we have force. If that same force existed, these same types of Shias and Muslims existed at the time of the Ahlul Bayt, right after Ghadir in Saqifa, then we wouldn't be in the same situation, would we? No. And every single subsequent imam, every single thing, everybody just wanted to remain in their houses. They didn't let their grief turn into action. They didn't turn it into something. So a true sign of a mu'min is that they do ta'adheem, they respect the signs of Allah, they don't bring their superstitions in there, and they let it turn into actual action. And the last point, before we move on to the masa'ib, is in the same way, Allah was saying this camel, this budna should be your best. It should be something that's difficult. It should be tough for you to sacrifice that. Don't bring, the skinny one. Don't bring something that's a waste for God. Give up something which is difficult for God. Give up something which is very tough for you. And now, I call out traditionalists. I'm going to go back to the liberals now. Look, this liberal progressive Islamic trend it's there, be honest. Is this something which is easy or difficult? Is saying that I'm going to take off my hijab, is that the easy thing to do or the hard thing to do in this society? Obviously, wearing hijab is difficult. What's easy is to, be and adapt with everybody else and take it off and not wear it. Is making physical contact, like shaking hands with a non-mahram, is that the easy thing to do or the difficult thing to do? It's the easy thing to do. It's the easy way out. It's not a real sacrifice. Is, sitting at a table when alcohol is being served, when, a client or a customer is inviting you for dinner and there's alcohol there, is that an easy or difficult thing to say, I'm sorry, I can't, be a part of the session? It's a difficult thing to do. So again, this is just an honest question that I want people who are into these trends, just think about it. All these intuitive things that you're believing in, are you doing things because they are the rational, right things to do, because there's truth and evidence behind it, or it's because it's the easy way out? Is not wearing hijab the easy way out or not? Is shaking hands with non-mahram the easy way out or not? Is, praying with everybody else and according to some people, we shouldn't even have masajid anymore. We should just have a center where everybody who believes in God comes together and prays. I don't even know what they mean by this, but everybody just comes together and prays to whatever God in whatever way they want. No. We want our own sha'air, we want our own symbols, and we have to make difficult choices. The life of a Muslim, specifically the life of a Shia, is supposed to be difficult. Our life is filled with bala. We've signed up for that. And if we're not willing to do that, then we really have to question whether we're really following the path of the Ahlul Bayt or not. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. These sha'air are very powerful in the fact that they give us a way to orient ourselves. They give us a trajectory. Sometimes when things get a little too abstract, or there's just mental ideas and philosophical things, sometimes we get lost, like I don't understand. A lot of us, we obviously feel sad at what happened to the Ahlul Bayt, what happened towards the end of the life of Rasulullah. Of course, we grieve when we think about what happened in Karbala. And we hear the stories and it breaks our heart, of course. But at the same time, us thinking about it, reliving and retelling the stories, that's one level of grief. But what happens when we actually go? You actually go to Najaf. You actually go to Kufa. You go to Mashhad. You go to Qum. You go to Karbala. What happens when you go and you look at the Furat? What comes to your mind then? Right? All these feelings and emotions flood you. You're seeing the Furat and say, look, I can easily now just grab a handful of water. The same one that was, even a 6-month-old was denied. Sometimes these physical symbols are necessary for us so we can connect our hearts to them. We want the darih. We want these harams to be beautiful. People ask questions, what's with all the gold? We want the Ahlul Bayt to be respected and dignified. So what's wrong with beautifying the areas that are there so that we can have that connection, so we can express our grief. Ya Allah, we say that these individuals at their time, they didn't do ta'adheem, they didn't beautify, they didn't understand the personalities of the Ahlul Bayt. Well, now that we have the chance, the opportunity, the financial means, we're going to do that. We will always keep creating these harams and these buildings to make sure that we are showing love for the Ahlul Bayt. So we grab onto the dhari. We shed tears, we hold on to it. We want that physical connection. So of course, when people say, oh, but the graves are still Al-Baqi, the graves are there, but it's just not enough. You look there and say, no, I want my imams to have something more. I want to hold on to something. I want to look at something, not just these rocks that are here. This is not the status of the Ahlul Bayt. It's not proper. But we'd say, Ya Aba Abdullah, Ya A'imma Al-Baqi, at least you have some place where we can go. We can go to Baqi, and we know where you're buried. We go to Karbala, we know where you're buried, Ya Aba Abdullah. We know where that Asghar is sitting on your chest. We know where Akbar is. We know where Qasim is. We know where they all are. We can go pay our respects to Imam Ali. We can go to Rasulullah. But the one who causes us the most grief, the most sadness and harshness, Mu'mineen, I ask you, where do we turn? When we think about the inhidam, the destruction, the takhrib that happened to Fatima, to Bibi Fatima, which way do our hearts turn? Some say, no, look to Baqi, that's where she must have been. She was buried in Baqi secretly over there. So do I turn to Baqi? Which way do I go? Which imam is she going to be next to? Is she in the front, in the back? Where do I express my grief? Some say, no, of course they buried her with her father, Rasulullah. So they go, say, where do I go? Where do I point and express my grief? Ya Rasulullah, we're sorry that this is what has happened to your daughter, that they came down, they attacked her house, and they threatened her with fire like this. Ya Rasulullah, she lost her baby. We wish the Muslims didn't do something like this to you. Or do we say, no, perhaps in the words of the ulama, they say, Bibi Fatima, of course, the only place she could have been is in Karbala, laying there with Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Both when he was losing his life, when Shimr was on top of his chest, they said this was Bibi, she was over there as well. And they say from that point, this is where her ruh will always remain. So you want to send your blessings, you want to send your salams and ta'aziyat to Bibi Fatima. Don't look at Al-Baqi, don't look at Masjid al-Nabawi. Turn your hearts and your minds to Abu Abdullah and Karbala and say, Assalamu alayki, ya bint Rasulullah. ألا لعنة الله على قوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما بأمره. ماتم حسين.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. If I can request our brothers to come forward, please. Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. All together. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. लबों से निकल कर आज़ान रो रही है मुसल्ले पे अकबर की माँ रो रही है लबों से निकल कर अज़ान रो रही है मुसल्ले पे अकबर की माँ रो रही है लबों से निकल कर अज़ान रो रही है मुसल्ले पे अकबर की माँ रो रही है लबों से निकल कर अज़ान रो रही है मुसल्ले पे अकबर अभी तो गया ही नहीं रन में अकबर अभी दिल है अकबर کے سینے کے اندر، مگر پھر بھی نو کے سینہ رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، لبوں سے نکل کر اذان رو رہی ہے، مصلی وہاں پر مدینے میں روتی ہے سغرا، یہاں پر سکینہ کے لب پر ہے نوحہ، وہاں پر مدینے میں روتی ہے سغرا، یہاں پر سکینہ کے لب پر ہے نوحہ، بہن ایک یہاں ایک وہاں رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، لبوں سے نکل کر اذان رو رہی ہے، مصلی دعا کری رہی ہے یہ کربل میں لیلا، نہ محتاج اکبر کو میرے خدایا، دعا کر رہی ہے یہ کربل میں لیلا، نہ محتاج اکبر کو میرے خدایا، جوانی یہ سن کر بیاں رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، لبوں سے نکل کر اذان رو رہی ہے، مصلی اے نازو کے پالا ذرا سا ٹھہر جا، کہ زینب سجا لے تیرے سر پہ صحرا، اے نازو کے پالا ذرا سا ٹھہر جا، کہ زینب سجا لے تیرے سر پہ صحرا، کہ آنو محمد کی ماں رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، لبوں سے نکل کر اذان رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کبھی خاک پر بیٹھ کر رہ گزر میں، جدائی میں اکبر کی ویران گھر میں، کبھی خاک پر بیٹھ کر رہ گزر میں، جدائی میں اکبر کی ویران گھر میں، بہن غم زدہ نیم جاں رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، لبوں سے نکل کر اذان رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے، مصلی پہ اکبر کی ماں رو رہی ہے۔ سورۃ الفاتحہ۔ السلام علیکم، السلام علیکم یا رسول اللہ، السلام علیکم یا امیر المؤمنین، السلام علیکم یا فاطمہ الزہرا، السلام علیکم یا حسن المجتبیٰ، السلام علیکم یا حسین شہید بھی کربلا، السلام علیکم ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ، السلام علیکم یا علی ابن حسین زین العابدین، السلام علیکم یا محمد ابن علی الباقر، السلام علیکم یا جعفر ابن محمد الصادق، السلام علیکم یا موسیٰ ابن جعفر الخادم، السلام علیکم یا علی ابن موسیٰ الرضا، السلام علیکم یا محمد ابن علی التقی، السلام علیکم یا علی ابن محمد النقی، السلام علیکم یا حسن ابن علی العسکری، السلام علیکم یا حجت اللہ ابن حسن یا صاحب العصر والزمان، سیدی الامان 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 من فتنة الزمان، اللہ السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا وذليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك وتطيعه فيها طويلا برحمتك.